And speaking on senators, do you think that it is possible, and I know you pretty much stated earlier that we really don't have evidence of high level Romans being Christians, with the obvious exception of Erastus, the treasurer. Uh, do you think it's possible that there was a Christian senator, we just don't know about him, that could have existed, that, and therefore could someone like him speculatively, tentatively have written one of the Gospels? Since you are, do you think that's possible in your mind?
So I'll give two. If I say yes, I'll give two caveats to that. The first is that I don't think it's impossible in these first centuries for someone to be Christian right, or Christian curious. I don't think that's impossible. And even by using the term Christian, whose version of Christianity? I tend to resist the idea that Christianity was incredibly diverse in the early centuries, just based on our evidence. But diverse meaning, populist, that there are multiple kinds of Christianity. I think that's a later theological problem. But there can be people other than Paul who are representing a certain vision of the significance of Christ from Judea, right? This Christ Jesus from Judea. So I think there could be some people who are curious about it, but still maybe are going, they're worshiping the emperor the way that they should, because if they're a senator, they want to stay alive. Or, so they're participating in emperor cults. They're participating, like best barbecue in antiquity was to participate in, an animal sacrifice. So they may still be eating meat to idols, we might say. They may be still doing their thing. But also are interested, like sampling something maybe from this other interesting new cult outside of, coming from Judea. I think that's totally possible. So I think we have to move away from this idea that once someone became a Christian, it was a wholesale conversion and that's it. Because I don't think that's sociologically how people tend to function, right? There's a transition period, right? To maybe going into a wholesale conversion, to use, our turning, in English we say conversion to another kind of religious affiliation. So I think that that's totally possible. And then if we say that a Roman senator, quote unquote, wrote the Gospels, I'm not sure the guy's doing it himself. I think in that case, again, I'll cite the work of Candida Moss, who's been working on this and has published a couple of recent articles on the subject of enslaved workers, producing some of this literature. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind. While some elite people who, spend their time being philosophers and writers in antiquity describe themselves, going to the library by themselves and poring over books and writing, it's actually quite a physically and, laborious process. We're not talking about like typing on a computer or, like writing in a notebook. We're talking about, large scrolls and codices. And so this is something that Moss has worked on. This is a lot of physical labor and not labor that these rich senators are probably likely to do themselves. So it brings up a question of authorship to some extent, if you're thinking about who's actually producing these things in that respect. And so I recognize that. So that would be the only, but there's still, authorship going on. There's still an author in that case to the text. And so I think we just want to be really, again, conscious of when we think about processes, what those processes may have looked like. So I wouldn't say that like, Roman Senator Bob, like converted to Christianity and wrote a text. So I'm just trying to trouble that a little bit to say, if we make that, there wouldn't have been a Bob, like Bobius. That's not a name. But you see what I mean. I don't think somebody like would have done the labor themselves, but they may have dictated the labor.
Are you also open to the dating of Paul's letters possibly being later as well? Because I think, if I remember correctly, in the book, you also seem to be, you don't really get into the exact dating of Paul's letters as well. I ask because I've been noticing there's a slow growth of scholars, movement of scholars that are growing. Like, the dating of Paul may be wrong, and that, by the way, also includes Professor Vincent, who I mentioned earlier. He thinks that.
I think that the work of people like Brent Nongbury too has been helpful in this area. Because I think we need to think quite a bit about what we mean when we talk about the texts that are compiled into the New Testament as texts. When were they put together? Because the texts that you read in the Bible, we don't have what's called autograph copies. This is not something that, it's not like we have like the original one, the original version of the letter to the Romans, and this is what it said. What we have in our Bibles is a Frankenstein's monster of different passages that have been taken from multiple papyri and other sources that have survived antiquity, and then based on a series of criteria scholars have put together to say this is our best bet for what it probably looked like, right? So that brings up a question of all of these texts that we analyze. We don't have the original, so how much can we say about them? Now, one thing that I try to be careful about in the book, two things. One was saying, acknowledging this fact still doesn't mean there wasn't some text that we call marked that did exist, that then was copied, published, and then, because of scribal error or, human intervention, changed in various regions or over time, right? This is why I'm interested in the book too, in the concept of authorship. And I talk quite a bit about Roland Barthes' Death of the Author, actually, because I fear that as a guild, when we start to say that, oh, well, if, there are multiple versions of a text that we then compile into one version of the text, then there is no author, or if there are multiple people who had to be involved in the publishing of a book, it would almost be like saying, like the book that you held up at the beginning, like, well, somebody else bound that book. I didn't do it personally. So am I the, like there's a copy editor who changed some stuff in there, so does that mean I'm no longer the author because, somebody, right. So I worry about that sometimes we get a little too extreme when we say, okay, well, there was a process here. There's more than one person involved. We don't have the copy in their original handwriting. Therefore, there's no author. I think that's a mistake that we make with these materials that we have to be careful about, because then you allow that slippage of, so then it must just be oral and therefore there's nothing we can say about this text, right? That's an extreme caricature of the situation, but it's one that I'm worried about. So with Paul, I think that there's definitely a concern. I mean, we know we don't have all the letters. We know that there's a good chance that something like 2 Corinthians did not look like that at all, that might be multiple letters that have been put together to seem cohesive. We also know that there were forgeries that, what we might call forgeries that circulated in early codices and early quote unquote canons that were letters that were impersonations of Paul. So I think Paul's writing before the war, personally, just based on my reading of his, again, quote unquote, theology. So, but that's kind of a separate question from, when were these letters compiled in the way that they were and circulated? That's an interesting question that I'm glad people are questioning, but I'm not quite ready to put Paul, I don't know, super late. I think he's before the war.
In the Epistle to the Philippians, Paul references his apparent access to the imperial guard of some kind at Caesar's household, or he mentions greetings to Caesar's household, and he also mentions Epaphroditus. There are some, such as Professor Eisman, that think that the Epaphroditus that Paul mentions is the same one Josephus dedicated his antiquities to. There are also some other early Christians that seem to think that Titus Flavius Clemens and Clement of Rome are also the same guy. But the question I'm really asking is, do you think, because I know that some people argue that, oh, well, when Paul is referring to Caesar's household, he's not really talking about Caesar's household. Do you think that Paul was literally referring to Caesar's household in his letter to the Philippians?
I think there's, again, good reason to look at this for a particular reason that I bring up. I think it's in chapter 3 of the book. It might be later. I'm getting further away from the book now, so it's harder for me to remember. It's in either chapter 3 or 4, where I talk about the shared motifs and themes between the Gospels and the text called the Satyricon. And in that discussion, I point out that there are scholars, and this kind of fits what we've been talking about the last few questions. There's a long tradition that the Satyricon was written by a Petronius who was in the household of Nero. And then in recent years, there's one scholar named Ulrike Roth who had published a couple of articles in the Classical Quarterly pointing out that there are a number of people named within the letters of Pliny that are also named in the Satyricon. And this is the same Pliny writing to Trajan about Christians. And so I took that and suggested that, well, what would happen if we imagined that the author of Satyricon, and actually kind of doesn't matter if the author is from the 1st century or the 2nd century, but what if we're talking about here by looking at things like you're talking about the names and reimagining, because if we get away from this idea that the Gospels had to only be produced, again, by, it's the oral tradition of an illiterate, Galilean peasant class, to look at this idea of like, let's re-examine these names. If so few people are actually writing, I know we were missing, the majority of writings from antiquity, but on the off chance that maybe we see some social connections here in social networks, I don't know that we've done proper social networking for early Christianity for the reason of our own assumptions about who produced these texts, right? So in my argument about Pliny and the Satyricon, this is, again, same Pliny writing to Trajan. Some people in this particular social network, they're thinking about Christians, and curious about them, or at the very least aware of them. Who else can we add into that social sphere of those particular elite Romans, and that can connect you back to Rome. And so then if you start to look at these networks and these names, I think it could do a lot of interesting work to see that this is something that is impacting not just these lower rungs of society as we've traditionally imagined. So I know I'm not directly answering your question, I'm sidestepping it a little bit because I haven't read it in a way towards that particular kind of conclusion that you're asking about, but it's something I've touched upon, and I do think it's a worthy endeavor to look at those things in more detail.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.